Balakun, a bridge to Ukraine. Join the conversation at balakun.org.
Балакун – міст в Україну. Приєднуйтесь до наших розмов на www.balakun.org.
Please subscribe.
Let's get straight into it. Maxim, thank you so much for joining us. It's a real pleasure to have you and to talk about some of your work and especially your new book as well. I'm Sandy. I'm in New Zealand. I started the Balakun organization, which is a volunteer organization to match people who are fluent English speakers with Ukrainians who are trying to learn English. I'll let Vitaly introduce himself. He was actually the first student to sign up, and we decided to do this podcast together for his speaking practice and to talk about things that we want to talk about and put them online.
Hi, Maxim. It's very nice to meet you. It's very nice to have you here. And I am eager to communicate with you and debunk some colonization mechanism of Russia. As I was thinking about today's episode, and I thought that at the first place, as me as Ukrainian and you as Ukrainian, we are well aware of all the Russian colonialism, and half of our audience are Ukrainians and half are all over the world. And I think that even for Ukrainians, there is much to talk about and much to contribute to their knowledge about colonialism, as the scale is just unimaginable. So it would be a pleasure if you lead more light on this topic.
Дякую. Thank you so much for inviting, and first of all, a huge respect for the work that you guys are doing. It's not only, like practical, because there are so many Ukrainians who want to get their stories out. This urge to get understood and get heard. It's so important, not only to spread the awareness and to spread the facts. And in this horrific genocide, but also it's part of the decolonization journey for Ukrainians, because this desire to be understood and or at least heard is part of the healing and part of the taking back control over your own story, over your own voice, to tell it the way you would like to be told. And this is something that unfortunately Ukrainians have been robbed for centuries. So you're part of this work. You're helping Ukrainians to gain their voice globally. So super massive respect and thank you so much. This is the least I can do to kind of honor the kind of work that you do, guys.
Awesome. It's a pleasure to have you. Before you go on, we have a student who signed up, and her reason for signing up was so that she could argue with foreigners online more effectively.
That's a very Ukrainian thing to say. Yeah, of course.
So why don't you tell us a little bit about your background and your work and your mission?
So I was born and raised in Ukraine, and I, from the very first early years, I remember, running around in my ancestral village in southern Ukraine after my grandparents and my relatives with this little tape recorder. And I was bothering them all the time to please, tell me your stories, where you come from, who you are, how you spent your youth, and all these facts. That's what I was hungry about. And I remember one of my earliest frustrations were that these stories that they would share with me always had these huge gaps. So, for example, my grandmother would tell me in a very detailed manner about her wedding that happened like 40, 50 years ago. But then she would not tell me how she spent the World War II, where she would not tell me her, how she survived the Holodomor genocide in 30s. And she would say like, yeah, I just survived. And I had these massive questions about why, some of our family members missing. My granddad, who was taken away, the half of family on my father's side were taken away overnight, and the families would not even talk about it ever. So trying to answer those questions, I think that naturally grew into, learning more about journalism and becoming one. And but with time, my career was focused on kind of, explaining Ukraine and my region back to the world. But while I was trying to do that, I understood that there are also massive gaps in explaining who I am and what I'm explaining. And at first I thought it's a problem of my family. But then I understand that it's a problem not only of our village, not our region, not only about our country, because I started connecting with people surrounding other nations surrounding Russia. And I start hearing horrifically the same kind of stories coming from people from different cultural backgrounds and histories. And this is how my work grew into this path of personal, individual decolonization, trying to reestablish our roots, trying to establish the history that and our stories that we're stalling, and kind of through that prism to explain who I am, who are my people to the rest of the world. So it's been quite a journey, but this is where I am now, trying to bring more light on the systemic serial problem with Russia, with Russian imperialism, colonialism, and kind of destroy those myths that for most of the foreigners, what is happening now in Ukraine is something unprecedented. It is not. It has been happening many times before, and will be happening many times after if we don't bring Russia to accountability for all those centuries of abuse.
I just wanted to make some reference. We had our episode on the 2 years anniversary of full-scale invasion and 10 years of the war in Ukraine. And we referred to the interview of a KGB agent that somehow escaped to United States and yada yada. We didn't know whether we should trust his words or not. He's Russian in the first place, so it's negotiable or controversial. But the thing that he told that the first step was demoralization. Like he referred to the four steps of ruining United States society that Soviets wanted, and the first one was the moralization itself. And I made this reference about how it happened in modern Ukraine after Ukraine gained its independence, and how this process lasted for years in terms of music, in terms of TV shows, in terms of television itself, and so on. And so this demoralization, I just focused on the last period of Ukraine history, and actually this demoralization happened for many years. And I know that you made a research for your guidebook, and you referred to different countries, modern countries that were part of the Russian Empire, and I guess that demoralization also happened to each of them.
Well, in the guidebook Russian Colonialism 101, we of course focused together with Ukrainian artists who illustrated that on just 100 last years, 111 to be exact. And we covered just one aspect of Russian colonialism in the pattern that Russian empire used to invade the societies and conquer them, to show this one formula that they used. And on the back of this book, there are 3 words: gaslight, invade, exterminate. And the gaslighting part is exceptionally important. And as you mentioned about the demoralization that you named, the part of the reason why we talk about and I want to focus specifically on the colonialism aspect of it, because what Russia is doing is not a simple land grab or some geopolitics or economic abuse of the neighbors. What Russia systemically does is also erases identities or tries to rewrite identities to ensure that the control of those lands that they stole is much more efficient. And that's why part of the colonialism practices, gaslighting is very important. When they created the entire mythology around it. So that helps Russians to dominate those conquered societies. The gaslighting happens either physically sometimes because they use genocide and ethnic cleansing and physical extermination of those who are not possible for them to convince that they're, say, Russians or someone else who they are not. But also there's the entire aspect of it where the mythology and propaganda creates to indoctrinate the conquered people that they're something that they're not. In case of Ukrainians, it's often that they're just Russians, that Ukrainians do not exist, that you've always been Russian, this land has always been Russian, you always spoke Russian, and all this gibberish about being Ukrainian is some foreign plot or misguided propaganda that you just, tricked into believing. For many other people, who are not that easy to assimilate, say people of different skin color or people from very different cultures, like in Northern Asia or Central Asia, they would just indoctrinate into thinking that they're just a second-class people, that they're less civilized, and they should be really grateful to Russians for so-called quote-unquote civilizing them. So anyway, in all of these cases, they create kind of a narrative that makes you feel that you're a second-class human being, that anything great, anything civilized, anything amazing can only happen in the metropole, in Moscow, in Russia. And anything connected to this is great, and anything that is different is not so great. And this is the foundation of this imperial mythology, because once we start talking about that some cultures, some countries are greater than the others, this is our red flag that this is imperial mindset, closely connected to colonization. And this is exactly how people who lived next to Russia, who suffered from Russian conquest, who are unfortunately are still captive nations within Russia, this is what they have to battle.
We had a conversation in a different forum about Ukrainian animation over the last 100 years or so, and that was a really interesting, well, it was an eye-opener for me that, that the idea that Ukrainian culture was expressed in film was quite deliberately sort of cartoonish without actually acknowledging any of the other aspects. Like there were never scientists or engineers or anything like that expressed in that kind of Ukrainian culture.
I was just wanted to add that I intimately understand it because I was raised to kind of really despise and hate the Ukrainianness in me by, was conditioned to believe that speaking Ukrainian, manifesting yourself in a Ukrainian way, in any way, like reading Ukrainian literature or being interested in our history, it will make lesser of me, because if I want to be a really educated person and achieve my greater potential, I should be speaking Russian, being interested only in Russian culture, and just manifesting myself to be as close to being Russian as possible, even if I will never pass, but I will try. And it does mess you up in many ways when you're ashamed to feel who you are. But with time, you clearly understand that this is part of the system. It's not just you. Many people feel like that way. And even if I was, growing up already in independent Ukraine, these cliches and this mythology was just surrounding me all the way through, because with formal independence, the Russian culture superiority over formal colony didn't end. So, the same kind of myths that Ukrainian culture is about silly people dancing, not being serious. It's all about folksy, silly stuff. But if you want to talk about real stuff, start speaking Russian and start reading Russian literature.
And moved to Moscow.
Which I did as well. Yeah, absolutely, 100%.
And speaking of Russian supremacy, that time when nothing seemed to be that obvious as it is now. I remember from my childhood in Crimea, there were many tourists there, and from Russia also. And that time they behaved very arrogant. And they behaved like they are the masters. They own this place. They are owners of this place. And in Ukraine, nothing happens, nothing good can happen, and everything good is in Russia. So in that time, in the beginning of current century, I can say, they behaved like they already have us.
100%. I think like everyone, not only Ukrainians, but everyone who has an experience of daily interactions or many interactions with Russians over their lives, they can tell us many similar stories. That's why our focus is always to shift it from just Putin, shift it just from this regime, and show that there is a serial pattern of behavior, and the entire society in Russia has this problem with imperial mindset and approach and thinking. And if we don't start addressing it, and if we don't show everyone that the society has to have this conversation first, and the society produced this genocide, and society produced Putin, then I don't think we will be any closer to justice whatsoever.
On a related note to that, we had a question from our community. One of our students asked you, what do you think are the most dangerous statements now which are helping Russians to justify their crimes and war crimes?
I think we can put aside the entire evil fascist propaganda that Moscow is manufacturing daily about the simple fact that they don't think that Ukrainian identity and Ukraine as a separate sovereign entity is a thing. So I think anything that fits into that is very dangerous to replicate. I mean, as a journalist, I pay extra attention all the time to the words that we use when we cover these complex stories, and especially for headlines that we use. I mean, let's be honest, like probably only journalists themselves read all the articles through. But the majority of people just see the headlines, and maybe they, just scroll through maybe some first couple of paragraphs, and this is what they take, and they don't really spend as much time on sifting through the text. And oftentimes, if you see the headlines, especially in Western coverage, they might mimic or channel really dangerous propaganda or narratives that are created by Russian propaganda. And I'm not talking just about Putin's regime. I'm talking about multi-century Russian propaganda that basically, in case of just Ukraine, keeps repeating that Ukraine is not Ukraine, Ukraine is Russia, and Ukrainians are almost identical to Russians, if not identically to Russian. This dangerous narrative about brotherly nations that basically is being used and exploited to justify genocide. Not only this one, because this is not the first time, not the first genocide that Russians are committing against Ukrainians. The latest one was exactly 100 years ago with the Holodomor genocide that murdered millions of Ukrainians. But even that one wasn't the first mass murder that Russians did to Ukrainians. And it was always under this false narrative that you're not your own people, you're just Russians, and therefore we own you and we have the right to do whatever we want just because you're part of us. How it's practically manifested, I think just in a recent example with the incident with First Lady Zelenska and the wife of the murdered Russian opposition leader Navalny, when they were the Biden administration tried to put them side by side during the State of the Union speech, and both declined. And part of the reason, of course, that it's it's exceptionally cruel to force Ukrainians into the same shared space with any Russians because of the level of re-traumatization that people are going. This is ongoing genocide. There's not enough conversation, not enough understanding what it does to people who are witnessing or are going through genocide, what it does for them to be in the same space with representatives of the group that commits genocide. And those people could, they could condemn genocide, or it doesn't matter. It's nothing personal. It's just how our psyche operates. This is how trauma develops. But on the other hand, there is more serious argument that every time when foreigners and Westerners trying to put together by force, mediate, they reproduce the same dangerous narrative that these are just brothers, sisters, broken families. This is just a dispute between family inside the family. This narrative, dangerous narrative that Russia has been using for centuries, exactly to justify what is doing to Ukraine now. And I think Ukrainians have been as loud as possible, as vocal as possible. Please do not help Russia to reproduce this narrative, because they're going to use it again for mass murder, and they're going to be using it over and over again if we don't put stop to it.
Our very first episode was about the perceptions of Ukraine in the world. And we wanted to cover the topic that it was very little known about Ukraine before 2014, and even before a full-scale invasion. And for non-Ukrainian guests, we always ask this question: what was your perception of Ukraine, and what have changed so far? Some of our guests visited Ukraine, some of our guests haven't, but the perception really changed. And it's very sad that it's because of tragedy, because of elimination of thousands of people, that it's sad that this tragedy led to change of perception. But we have won some attention, and we can show what we had through ages before. All the scientists, all the cultural figures, and so on. And for San personally, it was a discovery that Korolov was Ukrainian. It's just an example.
Yeah, but you see examples of that all the time now, where there'll be an artist in a gallery, and they'll be named, and it'll say Russian artist, and then actually no, that's not a Russian artist at all.
I think that's a very common feature for empires to steal and appropriate. I think what is different with Russian Empire, that for Russian Empire to form this ideology of civilizational mission, to be a missioner to spread the civilization, they had to back it up with something that is ancient, and that has like a historical, deep-rooted value. And by the time they understood that, they also understood that the Russia is not that old, and basically has just several centuries of history, and then Moscow is not that old city by Eastern European standards. And what they did specifically in 17th, 16th century is to steal Ukrainian identity for that. The entire word Rus is coming from Ukraine, not from Russia. And many abroad do not understand, or do not even know, that Moscow was one of the late-stage colonial outposts that Kiev established. If we talk about the roots of colonization in the region, the Kievan Rus started doing the colonization, and how Moscow became a thing. It became by settling a colonial outpost on the lands that didn't belong to Ukrainians in the first place. But through this stealing of the history, stealing very ancient Ukrainian history that dates back millennia, they were able to create this mythology that this is an ancient state, that it comes from Kiev, and then mythically, magically, at one point, everything that was great about Kiev teleported somewhere far, far north, to Siberia and became Moscow. And whatever happened to those people who lived in Kiev, nobody knows, and nobody is, interested. Suddenly, Kiev became Moscow. But this appropriation is an important aspect of Russian history, and of course, it kind of set up the chain events of constantly stealing and appropriating anything that is great within the empire. I know there is a podcast, so you cannot see the background of where I'm sitting, but I'm sitting in my study, and there's as a reproduction of Malevich, who's been this who is a worldwide known artistic name in avant-garde. And the majority of the world who knows the name Kazimir Malevich, they think that it's a Russian artist, despite that Malevich, his entire life manifested his Ukrainianness. And when Russians were torturing and killing him already at the end, he was adamant about identifying as Ukrainian and telling everyone that he's Ukrainian. But, for the rest of the world, Russians keep telling you that, there's great Russian avant-garde, there's great Russian cuisine, there's great Russian culture. But if you look really deep down, you can find traces of Georgian, Ukrainian, Belarusian, Kazakh, anything except, of course, Russian.
Mm-hmm. I kept seeing the word reunification of Ukraine and Russia coming out of their news yesterday, which I found quite disturbing. Like the idea that we're bringing it back, which is what they want people to believe, I suppose, that it was always ours. Ukraine was always ours, and we're just taking back what's ours.
I think part of the reason why we have this problem in the first place, I often talk about Iron Curtain. And Iron Curtain, I doesn't mean that this more popular belief during the Cold War era, right, that associated with Soviet Union. When I talk about Iron Curtain, I talk about much ancient and older concept of Russia and Moscow completely isolating any indigenous voices within the empire from the rest of the world. So for centuries, all the knowledge that you had abroad about Russia would come from Russians themselves. They had this monopoly on explaining Russia. What Russia stands for, where Russia comes from. They had total monopoly on explaining us as well, who are Ukrainians, who are Kazakh, what are their history, who they are as a people. Only the times when we would talk on our behalf, it would be heavily censored and usually often never happen. And since it was happening for centuries, now you have the situation when you have these vast amount of knowledge that was produced, but is very, very one-sided. And it's 100% coming from the perspective of the colonizer, not the colonized. So I see it as a Ukrainian, I see it everywhere daily. When I read news, when I hear foreigners talk about Ukraine or Russian neighborhood, and sometimes I hear it from the friends, and I hear it from people who passionately support Ukraine. But because it's so deep, they reproduce it in simple sentences, in simple narratives that they feel like true, because this is how people got their knowledge abroad, through Russian lenses. And I'm very happy that this is slowly, painfully, in horrific circumstances, but is starting to change.
That was another question that I had, is why is it that people outside of Ukraine seem to get so much of their information about what's happening in Ukraine from Russians? And I don't think it's the fact that Ukrainians don't speak English. There's plenty who speak English. It's just that we listen to this famous Russian person about the conflict, or about the war, sorry.
No, 100%. And I think that's why the projects like you guys do are so important, to equip Ukrainians also with the necessary tools and language tools to tell their stories as close to the original as possible. But let me tell you like just one example. I think it's very illustrative. It's a bit on the side of journalism, and tells you lots about why the coverage of journal inside the journalism, foreign journalism, is a bit distorted. So just recently, we've been doing the premiere of the book in Berlin, and right before the premiere, I got an email from a German journalist, a journalist from German publication, one of the largest one. And that person asked me for an interview. They said, well, hey, we heard about this premiere. We want to learn more. We want to tell the story about it. And I was like, great, this is massive publication. Happy to do it. But then my standard security practice, I didn't know that journalist, that person. I did a basic security check to find out who that person is. And I found out that person is a Russian. And for me, it was instant and no-go to accept an interview request and then allow my story to be told by a Russian journalist. And that's nothing personal. That journalist could be absolutely amazing at what they do. But there is a horrific context to it of centuries of Ukrainian stories being told by Russians. So our conversation, no matter how good that person could have been, could not happen on equal terms. I would come from the position of power imbalance. And I wouldn't like to reproduce the same power imbalance by allowing another Russian to tell my story and trust that this time they will do it great, because we don't have a good experience with that. Never worked out before. But what happened next was more interesting, because instead of just ignoring the request, I decided to reach out to the management of that newsroom and to ensure that they understand what was wrong, why they shouldn't be sending Russian reporters to interview Ukrainians, and how many Ukrainians could not have this luxury of saying no and passing on the huge platform and opportunity to tell their stories. And we, with friends, we reached out to two people from that newsroom, two reporters. One reporter instantly said, yeah, I totally understand what's wrong. Yeah, this is the context. I understand this is not cool. We will talk with inside the newsroom, and we will try to maybe send someone else. The second person did not understand what I'm talking about. And that person said, I don't really understand what's the problem. Have you tried to talk to that Russian journalist first? And I was trying to reach to that person, telling that this is exactly the problem. I don't want to talk to that person, and I don't want for you guys to put any Ukrainians in position when they need to choose between a very important interview and being forced to tell their stories through the filter of another Russian person. So the person who didn't understand was a guy, and the person who did understand was a female reporter. And why it's important, I think, is because it shows you that inside the newsroom, if there's not enough diversity and not enough people with sensitivity towards power imbalances, towards lived experiences, what it's like to be a part of a disfranchised group or group that does not enjoy all the privileges out there that usually in Western societies are available to any white man. This kind of prevents people from seeing those power imbalances and results in situations like these. It doesn't mean that the person coming from a privileged background cannot do that coverage right. But if that person is not surrounded by enough diversity in terms of their colleagues, the chances that it will cover it right and understand what is the problem are next to zero.
So do you think it's ignorance rather than malice? It's not someone's deliberately trying to put two people in a room together to cause a conflict?
Honestly, I don't believe that it's malice. Sometimes I feel like also some Western people trying to play this role of mediator, but it's mostly about them not understanding that maybe they're not in position. First of all, nobody asked you to. So if you feel the urge to play a mediator, to ask people to hug it out or to be friends, or to sit them shoulder to shoulder at State of the Union, ask yourself whether you were asked to do that by those people in the first place. And if you weren't asked to do that, ask yourself, why do you have this urge to play mediator? Why you think that you're positioned to do that? What kind of lived experiences really informed you that well that you can be a mediator in all of this? And I feel this is where we come at the question whether these people are also share some of the imperialistic views and feel like they're superior in some way, that suddenly without lived experiences, they feel like they're in right position to be mediators.